Many cultural icons were introduced in the year 1985. Coca-Cola introduced New Coke. It was pulled from the shelves 55 days later. One of my favorite comic strips, Calvin and Hobbes, was first published that year and stayed in syndication for 10 years. The NBA Rookie of the Year was a young phenom named Michael Jordan, who played for 15 seasons. A company was founded that revolutionized how we watched movies. Blockbuster stayed in business for almost 30 years. And Microsoft launched Windows 1.0 that year. 1985 was also the year when an important change to our Unitarian Universalist culture was introduced. At the association's General Assembly that year, the delegates voted to adopt a significant revision to Article 2 of the UUA bylaws. This is the section of the bylaws that contains the association's purposes, its principles, and a few other sections which define who we are, which help shape the core of our UU identity. By the time 1985 rolled around, there had been several years of discussion and debate whether to change the 6 principles of Unitarian Universalism, which had been enshrined in Article 2 since the Unitarians and Universalists merged in 1961. Indeed, there were many who believed that if the two faith groups had not been able to agree on a common set of principles, the merger would never have happened. But a quarter of a century later, it was decided those founding principles needed to be refreshed as they reflected the gendered language and Judeo-Christian focus of 1960s Unitarian Universalism. What they came up with in 1985 were the 7 principles and 5 sources which we still use today. If you would like to review them, they're printed in the gray hymnal on the 2 pages before the first hymn. A 6th source, recognizing earth-centered traditions, was added 10 years later. Otherwise, these principles and sources have remained virtually the same for over 35 years. But at the General Assembly this June, the delegates will take the first of 2 votes on a proposal to significantly revise Article 2, a proposal which would replace the 7 principles and 5 sources with a new approach for defining our identity as a faith. As you can imagine, there are strong opinions both in favor and opposed to this proposal. This morning, I would like to share with you an overview of the proposed changes, why this is being considered, and thoughts about some of the reactions to the proposal. There will be an in-person coffee hour discussion in the cottage after the service for anyone interested in more details about the proposal, and a Zoom discussion will be offered sometime after Jamie returns next week. The current Article 2 contains 4 sections: principles, purposes, inclusion, and freedom of belief. The proposed new Article 2 has made some changes to those last 3 sections, but today I would like to focus on the changes to the principles section, as it has been changed the most and is the most controversial. The centerpiece of this section are the list of 7 principles and 6 sources, both of which the proposed Article 2 would not include. The proposal replaces the principles section with 2 sections, one called Values and Covenant, and the other called Inspirations. The Values and Covenant section begins with what I have dubbed the Love Preamble. A portion of that preamble states, "Love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love." The preamble is followed by a graphic of our shared values. If the tech team could please display the first slide. Okay, so this is an image of what they are proposing. There are 6 shared values depicted, 1 on each arm or petal, and in the center is love, overlaying the flaming chalice. If we could see the next slide, please. Following the graphic in the proposal, and yes, they're planning on putting a graphic in the bylaws, if they can technically do it. Couldn't do it in 61, but they can do it today. Following the graphic is a 1-sentence description for each of the 6 values: interdependence, equity, transformation, pluralism, generosity, and justice. I should note that these have not been placed in any specific order. They even said that if they would, every time you open up the bylaws, they wish they would appear in a different order. There is no first value or 6th value, although love is considered the central value. Remember that this section is called Values and Covenant. What is not displayed on the screen is that after each value description, there is a 1 or 2 sentence covenant statement for that value. For example, after interdependence is the statement, "We covenant to cherish Earth and all beings by creating and nurturing relationships of care and respect. With humility and reverence, we acknowledge our place in the great web of life, and we work to repair harm and damaged relationships." Okay, the tech team could stop sharing the slide now. The other new section is called Inspirations, and it is intended to replace the sources. But it no longer lists any specific sources. Instead, it is a general statement that reads, "As Unitarian Universalists, we use and are inspired by sacred and secular understandings that help us to live into our values. We respect the histories, context, and cultures in which they were created and are currently practiced. These sources ground us and sustain us in ordinary, difficult, and joyous times. Grateful for the religious ancestries we inherit and the diversity which enriches our faith, we are called to ever deepen and expand our wisdom." So now you have a feel for what is offered for consideration by the delegates at the 2023 and 2024 General Assemblies. But why have these changes been proposed? The immediate answer is that in 2020, the UUA Board of Trustees created a study commission to review Article 2 and propose any changes the commission believes will refresh the definition of UU identity after they've engaged with UUs across all demographics, identities, and theological or philosophical beliefs. There were several factors that convinced the board of the need to create the study commission, including some proposed changes to Article 2 from 2009 failed by only 13 votes. A proposed change to the first principle that was withdrawn in 2017 for future consideration. A movement to add an 8th principle, which many congregations, including ours, have already adopted. A long-standing feeling that the current principles are hard to remember, except for the 1st and 7th. A concern that the current principles don't ask us to do anything, or as one commission member put it, they have no verbs. And a regret that love, which is central to our faith, is nowhere to be found in our principles. But in addition to these immediate concerns, there's also a theological or philosophical answer to the question of why we are considering changing Article 2. You see, when the UUA bylaws were adopted in 1961, they realized that our UU identity needed to evolve and adapt to the times, that ours is a living tradition, drawing from the past but looking towards the future. So they included in the bylaws a provision that Article 2 should be reviewed at least every 15 years. Not that it must be changed that frequently, but as a faith, we remain open to the possibility of change. Our liberal faith asks us to start from a position of willingness to engage with the idea of change. So in 2020, the UUA board created the study commission and gave them carte blanche to propose changing as much or as little of Article 2 as their discernment deemed appropriate. The board's charge to the commission did offer some guidance, of course, as to what they felt was important for the commission to consider. In particular, the charge emphasized, quoting, "The principles and purposes should lead us into the second quarter of the 21st century while honoring the historic roots of our liberal progressive faith. We therefore charge this commission to root its work in love as a principal guide in its work, attending particularly to the ways that we and our root traditions have understood and articulated love and how we have acted out of love." In January, after more than 2 years of talking with thousands of UUs, the Commission submitted its report to the UUA Board. Now it will be discussed, amended, and voted on at General Assembly this June. But that's just the first step. If a simple majority of the delegates vote to accept the proposal, that only commits congregations to spend a year living with the proposed Article 2. Then at next year's General Assembly, a second vote would be taken, and if more than 2/3 of the delegates vote in favor, the new Article 2 would be adopted. I think this two-step approach was another wise choice by the drafters of the bylaws. By introducing a gap year between accepting a change and adopting a change, a delegate voting in favor of the proposal this year may do so if they are open to discussing the possibility of change, even if they have reservations about the proposal. And believe me, people do have reservations. Some are concerned about certain words that are included or excluded from the proposal. The Commission has already responded to some of these concerns. For instance, in the early draft, one of the values was called evolution, but there was resistance to this name, so it has been changed to transformation. And given what is happening in the world today, several people were concerned that use of democratic processes was not included in the first draft. The Commission heard that feedback and added it as part of the covenant statement associated with the justice value. I myself have submitted an amendment suggesting that the not changing any words, just changing the way it's laid out. I suggested that the covenant statements be grouped together in their own section rather than interspersed after each value statement to simplify how we talk about the values. That slide I had up earlier is the way I would like to see it in the bylaws, because one of the complaints people have said, and I've conducted feedback sessions, so I've heard this, is that it's too wordy. But that's because they're combining both the values and the covenant. So keep them side by side, but separate. So that's my idea. We'll see if it goes anywhere. I'm sure there will be many other amendments proposed and voted on at General Assembly. Some will be approved, most will not. The question is whether those that want specific changes are willing to accept the proposal, even if their concerns are not addressed. Voltaire is credited with the saying, "The perfect is the enemy of the good." That is what each delegate will need to decide. Is this proposal good enough, even if it may not be perfect? The covenant associated with the value of transformation encourages us that we covenant to collectively transform and grow spiritually and ethically. Openness to change is fundamental to our Unitarian and Universalist heritages, never complete and never perfect. Others have more substantive concerns about the proposal. For instance, there is concern about the replacement of the 6 sources with it, just that general statement I read earlier, called inspirations. One reason the 2009 proposal failed by 13 votes was due to objections by some humanists to changes to the sources. And the charge by the UUA Board reminded the Commission that there had been a lot of discussion recently to recognize additional sources, such as Islam and Buddhism. So the Commission opted to not recognize any specific source by name, a change which may upset those who are strongly attached to one or more of those sources. The Commission argues, we felt a better use of the bylaws would be to articulate what our inspirations do and how we should approach any source of inspiration. And I would argue that the proposed statement on inspirations better reflects our commitment to being an inclusive faith. Any list of sources excludes those sources not mentioned, or at least marginalizes them. Removing the list of sources from our bylaws does not prevent us from discussing them in our pulpits or in our religious education curriculum. It simply does not privilege some sources over others. Of course, the most controversial feature of the Article 2 proposal is replacing the 7 principles with the 7 values. And I use replacing cautiously because, like with the sources, they are being replaced in our bylaws, but not in our culture. No one is going to come rip them out of the front of the hymnals or prevent us from ever mentioning them again. As a matter of fact, The commission would argue that the principles are rooted in our shared values. So it would be wrong to view the new Article 2 as renouncing the past. The values and the principles are inextricably tied together. Now, when presented with a major change like this, I know the first inclination is to compare the new Article 2 with the old Article 2. I've seen slides, people doing side-by-side comparisons, to decide which we like better. But maybe that should not be our initial reaction. Maybe the first question we should ask ourselves is, if Unitarian Universalism was being formed today, would you be comfortable that this proposal adequately describes our faith? Start by judging the proposal on its own merits and use that as your starting point, whether you are ready to accept the proposal. And everyone realizes that accepting such a significant change can be difficult for many. For those of us of a certain age, we have lived with the 7 principles for a long time, and they have become a part of our identity. To change that means giving up a piece of ourselves. In their report, the Commission recognized the emotional difficulty of such a change. They said, whenever there is change, there is loss. And where there is loss, there is grief. We honor the fact that there is a loss in changing what has become so familiar to us. Moreover, for many of us, the principles have become the go-to answer when asked the somewhat difficult question, what is Unitarian Universalism? But the principles are still a part of who we are, so you haven't really lost that answer. Instead, view the proposal as having gained a new answer, because now you could also talk about the shared values and covenant of our faith. Perhaps I am more open to this change because the principles have never been my go-to answer. When asked to describe Unitarian Universalism, I always reply that ours is a religion where you can change your beliefs without having to change your church. We are being asked to consider changing not our beliefs, but how we present those beliefs by focusing on our shared values centered in love. I hope we are open to the possibility of change and are willing to engage in the discussion, because it is a discussion that we were asked to have periodically, and one I think it is well worth having. And the Commission realized that their proposal is not perfect, but they are asking us to consider whether it offers a meaningful description of our faith for the next generation of Unitarian Universalists. In the conclusion of their report, they said, "We knew we would never write something that everyone thought was perfect. Perfection was not the goal. We knew that no matter what we produced, there would be things people wished we had added, things people did not like, and things people appreciated. What we tried and what we think we succeeded in doing was to create an Article 2 that articulated our faith today and in the near future." May it be so.